Okay, at the end of the last video, I suggested that if Franzen is discussing maybe, interpolation, narrative theory of the self, which is committed to the idea that a self involves having memory in a certain way, we might ask, well, is this actually different than John Locke's view about the psychological continuity of the self? And the answer here is yes. The idea, I think, interpreting Franzen's piece in this way, it's not just that a self is a psychologically continuous thing over time, where one has access to the same memories of past events in one's life or past experiences from one's life. It goes a little bit deeper than that. And why? Why is that? Because Franzen's piece in particular, by focusing on Alzheimer's, strangely and somewhat tragically, but nonetheless, if it's right, then it's true, draws a kind of parallel between what? Well, between Alzheimer's the disease of his father and the experience of his father, and Franzen's own, Jonathan Franzen's own story about his father. In what way? In this way. That a narrative theory of the self in this vein is not just a concern about how it is that we make sense of a coherent self over time, such that we rely upon memory. It's deeper in the sense that a narrative theory of the self also relies upon forgetfulness. And relies upon it in a way in which forgetting and forgetfulness is not just some kind of added feature of the self. It's another constitutive feature. It's a structural feature of who it is that we are. And so, to suggest that is to say that it's non-negligible. It's a necessary condition for understanding what a self is at all. It's over and above just a thinking thing. It's over and above a psychologically continuous self. In fact, a psychologically continuous self presupposes the idea that a self which employs memories in order to remember who a self is or was implies forgetting others, forgetting other memories, or placing them somewhere outside of conscious thought or awareness. So that forgetfulness becomes a structural feature of who it is that we are. Against the thought, perhaps, it would have to be something like a thought experiment, because it's not indicative of our own experiences of ourselves. At least, as far as I can tell, most of us, if not all of us, of having, say, a perfect recording system, such that we could just pull up memories as if we were hard disks or computers out of our stored data, out of our hard drives, or out of our accessible memory, in that kind of metaphorical way of talking about a computer. And so in this way, I think this narrative theory of the self that Franzen's pulling out in this amazing, if nonetheless tragic, parallel between Alzheimer's and himself and relating the story, shows forgetfulness as a constitutive feature of the self. And in this way, and I want to put this in a hyperbolic way, purposefully hyperbolic, suggests that in fact all of us have Alzheimer's throughout our lives, if it's the case that forgetfulness is a constitutive feature of the self. I'm not saying, of course, that we have the disease of Alzheimer's, but there is a sense in which forgetfulness really means something to us, even if we don't like to admit it sometimes. And so I want to just read a few more things from this piece. One has to do with what I take to be the ultimate purpose of Franzen's piece and why he's writing in this way. And I think it comes on page 31. This is after the kind of amazing squiggly pictorial depiction, that's redundant I suppose, depiction of his father's decline. He says on 31, he held himself together longer, I suspect, than it might have seemed he had the neuronal wherewithal to do. Then he collapsed and fell lower than his pathology may have strictly dictated. and he chose to stay low 99% of the time. What he wanted in the early years to stay clear, in the later years to let go, was integral to what he was. Or I'm in the way that I'm kind of talking about it, I might say was integral to who he was. And he continues, and what I want, stories of my father's brain that are not about meat, is integral to what I choose to remember and to retell. And then maybe just a few more pages. He does compare this in telling this story about his father, in telling about how it is that he learned more about his own mother in relation to his father and to his parents' relationship, but clearly a rocky one, a not so happy one throughout their lives. One second. So in relating this story, he's relying upon, in many instances, his mother's account of what's happening with his father, with her husband, and often relying upon the letters that he receives from her. And he does mention, in particular, what seems to be a concern about a Platonic theory over writing. This is on page 32 and 33. In relying on my mother's letters to reconstruct my father's disintegration, I feel the shadow of the undocumented years after 1992, when she and I talked on the phone at greater length and ceased to write all but the briefest notes. Plato's description of writing in the Phaedrus as a crutch of memory seems to me fully accurate. I couldn't tell a clear story of my father without those letters. But where Plato laments the decline of the oral tradition and the atrophy of memory which writing induces, I, Jonathan Franzen, at the other end of the age of the written word, am impressed by the sturdiness and reliability of words on paper. My mother's letters are truer and more complete than my self-absorbed and biased memories. She's more alive to me in the written phrase, he needs distractions, than in the hours of videotape or stacks of pictures of her. And so where Plato, again, seems to have a theory in which writing can be a kind of artful deceit against the oral tradition, which relies strictly upon an incredible memory. The artful deceit comes in filling in those pictures and filling in those narratives, which might not be completely true. And so, in this narrative theory of the self, another large question, having to do with memory, having to do with forgetting, one that I'm not going to answer, has to do with, in this narrative theory of the self, to what extent are the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and about the others around us, especially those who we love and care for, in what sense are they true? Or in what sense are they false? Or likewise, in what senses do these ideas of fiction versus reality overlap or bleed into one another or permeate one another, as opposed to the kind of strict separation that we sometimes think about when we think about reality versus fiction, when we think about the real world versus an illusory world, in the way that Descartes perhaps thought in those meditations. A large question. Let me end with one more thought about Franzen. I really enjoy the way, and I feel as though in talking about this theory of the self, I'm not doing any kind of justice to this essay because it's such a wonderful, if again, tragic redescription of learning more about his father's life and his mother's life, of dealing with this tragedy which many people, many Americans deal with. There's just so much to the story which I think is incredible. One of the ways that I really enjoy the story is the way that he both begins it and ends it, with this emphasis on memory and forgetting. So let me just read that part and then I'll turn over to Todd May. So he begins, here's a memory. On an overcast morning in February of 1996, I received in the mail from my mother in St. Louis a Valentine's package containing one pinkly romantic greeting card, two 4-ounce Mr. Good bars, one hollow red filigree heart on a loop of thread, and one copy of a neuropathologist report on my father's brain autopsy. He starts off, here's a memory. By the end of the piece, a piece about the loss of itself, the loss of memory in a specific way. When his father is finally deceased, he mentions how we'd simply lost the last parts out of which we could fashion a living whole. There would be no new memories of him. The only stories we could tell now were the ones we already had. And in a sense, it's these stories about himself, about his father in particular, which seem to be ending. And that in itself is something tragic in losing that notion of what a self is. Okay. So consider this narrative theory in relation to not only Franzen stories, but also previous theories of the self that we've discussed. Descartes, John Locke, Thomas Reid, perhaps others from the Blackburn chapter. And I'm curious to hear what it is that you think about the nature of the self, and whether this narrative theory, including specifically forgetfulness as a constitutive feature of a narrative theory, is right? Is it wrong? Can it be honed a bit further? Are there objections to it? Can there really be the separation of questions between who are we and what are we? Or are they necessarily tied up with one another? So I think there's a lot of questions involved with this narrative theory itself. Okay, I'm going to end this video and start a new one.